Ukraine has 1% of the Patriot missiles it needs. The answer might be a missile older than most of its soldiers. Volodymyr Zelensky told CNN this month that Ukraine currently has about 1% of the Patriot interceptors it needs. Not 10%, not half, 1%. Heading into a winter where Russia is launching roughly twice as many ballistic missiles per month as it was in 2025, while Allied deliveries of interceptor missiles have dropped to roughly a third of last year's pace. So naturally, the conversation in Kyiv this month keeps circling back to a missile that entered U.S. service in the late 1950s, went out of the American Army inventory in 1996, and sounds like something you'd find bolted to a museum wall next to a placard about the Cuban Missile Crisis. The MIM-23 HAWK. And here's the part almost nobody explaining this story gets right. Nobody serious is arguing that a Cold War missile system should replace Patriot. That's not the pitch. The pitch is narrower and considerably smarter. HAWK doesn't have to become Patriot. It only has to stop Patriot from getting wasted on targets that a cheaper, older missile can already handle. Hey friends, Wes here, defense journalist, Army and Air Force veteran. Today we're taking apart the HAWK missile system, how many the US has actually sent Ukraine, whether it can touch a ballistic missile at all, and why an air defense weapon designed to stop Soviet bombers in the Eisenhower administration is back in the conversation during the worst interceptor shortage of this entire war. Now, the natural reaction to Ukraine is out of interceptors is to demand more of the exact same interceptor. More Patriots, more PAC-3s. That's understandable, and Zelensky is doing exactly that in every meeting he can get. But air defense doesn't actually work as a single weapon problem, and treating it that way wastes the one resource Ukraine can't replace on demand. The real question is whether HAWK can absorb enough of the workload Patriot is currently wasting itself on so that the handful of PAC-3 interceptors Ukraine actually has in reserve gets spent only on the threats nothing else can stop. Let's establish exactly how bad the shortage has gotten, because the numbers Zelensky gave this month are stark enough to speak for themselves. Ukraine is currently operating with roughly 1% of the Patriot interceptor stockpile it estimates it needs. Zelensky said 5% of the current U.S. stockpile would carry Ukraine through the winter. 10%, he said, would be enough to stop every Russian ballistic missile attack outright. Now, neither number is currently on the table. Interceptor deliveries from allies fell to roughly a third of 2025's pace during the first half of this year, thanks to Middle East War III, the search for more oil. Now, the Center for Strategic and International Studies estimates that Iran's ballistic missile campaign alone consumed about 1,500 PAC-3 interceptors from American reserves. Meanwhile, Russia has reportedly exceeded its own annual production targets for ballistic missiles. Russia is accelerating that production specifically ahead of winter. That's the environment HAWK is walking back into. It's not a hypothetical scenario, an active shortage during an active escalation. Heading into the season Russia has historically used to target power infrastructure hardest. Wait, why does Russia target civilians? Oh, because they're assholes. I forgot. HAWK, H-A-W-K, stands for Homing All the Way Killer, a name that belongs to an era when weapons got named by people who weren't yet worried about lawyers reading the acronym out loud in a press briefing. The system entered U.S. service in the 1950s, developed specifically to counter high-flying strategic bomber raids, and it was repeatedly upgraded over the following decades to handle jamming and electronic countermeasures as those threats started to evolve. It's a medium-range, surface-to-air missile system built around a radar-guided kill chain. Acquisition radars find the target, a high-power illumination radar locks onto it, and the missile rides that illumination to intercept. The current Phase 3 variant, which is what Ukraine is actually operating, was never built for a drone-saturated modern battlefield. It was built for aircraft and later cruise missiles. But what it's become is a usable middle-tier air defense tool sitting between short-range systems like Stinger and Avenger on one end and Patriot on the other. The U.S. removed HAWK from its own Army inventory in 1996 and from the Marine Corps inventory in 1998. Oh, late to the party, Marines. That gap is kind of a big deal, and we'll come back to it because pulling a 30-year dormant weapon system back into active combat isn't as simple as flipping a switch. So how many HAWKs does Ukraine actually have? Well, this is where the public reporting gets messy. Publicly confirmed, the United States has committed at least 2 HAWK firing units to Ukraine, announced under the USAI program in February 2023. Now, the U.S. also began shipping HAWK interceptor missiles in 2022, with quantities withheld for operational security reasons, and has since funded refurbishment, sustainment, spare parts, missile repair, and fire unit overhaul through multiple aid packages. What hasn't been published is a clean total count of every launcher, every battery, every fire unit, and every missile the U.S. has actually delivered. The confusion comes from terminology that sounds interchangeable and isn't. A 2026 Federal Register notice lays out the actual structure. One HAWK fire unit consists of a command post, a high-power illumination radar, a continuous wave acquisition radar, 3 launchers, 2 missile loaders, generators, and a basic load of MIM-23 missiles. So a full battery doubles the launcher count to 6 and adds a second illumination radar. So when a press release says 2 HAWK systems, that phrase alone doesn't tell you whether Ukraine received 2 launchers, 2 full fire units, or 2 complete batteries. Those are wildly different quantities of actual firepower. Spain, olé, is a separate thread worth including. Spain sent 4 HAWK launchers in 2022, then announced a complete 6-launcher battery in 2024. The original U.S. position was that its refurbished missiles would complement Spain's launchers, which is more or less how Ukrainian air defense has operated across this entire war. One ally brings the launcher, another brings the ammunition, and somehow the resulting patchwork ends up killing Russian cruise missiles anyways. Okay, so here's the big question I get emailed to me at least once a week. Can the HAWK handle ballistic missiles? The official U.S. description of HAWK Phase 3 states it's designed for mid-range defense against fixed-wing aircraft, helicopters, cruise missiles, and a limited number of tactical ballistic missiles when cued from an adequate 3D source. Every one of those qualifying phrases carries weight. Limited number, tactical ballistic missiles, not intermediate or advanced. When cued, meaning it needs external radar support to even attempt the engagement. From an adequate source, meaning not every radar setup will actually supply what HAWK needs. Translated into plain English, under favorable conditions with proper cueing from another sensor against a lower-end tactical ballistic threat, HAWK has some intercept capability against the kind of missiles Russia is actually launching at Ukrainian cities right now. Now, HAWK's ballistic missile capability lives entirely inside that gap. The phrase, when cued from adequate 3D sources, it's the entire condition on which the capability rests. HAWK's own radar wasn't built to independently generate the kind of fire control quality track a ballistic intercept demands. It needs another sensor doing that work first, then handing HAWK a target picture good enough to act on. That's not a criticism of the missile, it's just how a kill chain built in the 1950s and 60s was ever going to function against a threat category that didn't fully exist when the system was designed. Remember, back then, the worry was spy planes flying over U.S. territory and Soviet jets like the Foxbat getting faster and faster. So every layer in a modern air defense network depends on the layer below it feeding it good information, and HAWK's ballistic capability is a direct illustration of what happens when that dependency is stretched right up to its limit. Every cruise missile, aircraft, helicopter, or drone that HAWK intercepts is one fewer target competing for attention from NASAMS, IRIS-T, SAMP-T, or Patriot. More specifically, every threat HAWK removes from the sky is a threat Ukraine didn't have to burn a scarce interceptor on. Now, ballistic missiles are dramatically harder to intercept than drones and cruise missiles because of their speed and steep terminal trajectory. That difficulty is exactly why the interceptor best suited to the hard problem shouldn't be spent on the easier one. Think of it as a layered system rather than a ranked hierarchy of quality. Patriot handles the threats only Patriot can reliably stop. That's it. Patriot shouldn't be used for anything else. HAWK, sitting in the middle tier, absorbs cruise missiles, aircraft, helicopters, and some larger or jet-powered drones. Threats that would otherwise get shot down by something far more expensive than necessary. Every layer that successfully handles its own portion of that threat picture is one less demand competing for the layer above it. So, with Ukraine sitting at 1% of its required Patriot stock, that math isn't a nice to have. It's close to the entire strategy for surviving winter with the interceptors currently on hand. The challenge is that HAWK left 1996, which means that the sustainment tail behind the weapon had to be rebuilt from close to nothing. Old missiles require recertification before they're safe to fire. We don't want them blowing up Ukrainian missile operators on the ground. Radars pulled out of long-term storage need overhaul. Launchers need parts that stopped being manufactured in America decades ago. Crews need training on hardware that most currently serving soldiers have never touched. And that is exactly why the recent aid packages matter as much as the missiles themselves. A $138 million 2024 emergency sale covered engineering support for HAWK, communications integration, fire unit refurbishment, missile recertification, components, tools, and test equipment. Another $172 million 2025 package added sustainment, spare parts, fire unit overhaul, technical documentation, training, missile repair, and logistics support. Now, none of that is a hardware upgrade. It's the unglamorous infrastructure that determines whether an old launcher can actually wake up, talk to a radar, receive a target from a command post, fire a certified missile, and repeat that sequence the following night without something breaking. Ukraine's larger air defense picture also faces a separate unresolved thread that we need to talk about. Trump raised the possibility at the NATO Ankara summit of licensing Ukraine to manufacture its own Patriot interceptors domestically. Then he expressed uncertainty about the idea days later, and manufacturing officials who traveled to Kyiv to discuss it haven't produced a public result. HAWK's return isn't happening because that longer-term solution failed. It's happening because that longer-term solution, even if it eventually works, arrives on a timeline measured in years, and winter arrives in just a few months. For most of this war, the instinct in Western coverage has been to rank air defense systems by prestige. Patriot at the top, everything else treated as a downgrade. But that ranking makes sense if you're comparing raw capability against a single threat in isolation, but it falls apart the moment you're managing a finite stock of the best interceptor against an adversary launching 2 or 3 times as many threats as it was a year ago. Under those conditions, the correct question stops being, what's the best system, and becomes, what's the right system for this specific target? So the best system stays available for the target nothing else can touch. HAWK's revival isn't nostalgia, and it's not desperation dressed up as strategy. It's Ukraine treating every layer of its air defense network as a resource allocation problem, where an old, cheap, partially rebuilt missile system earns its place specifically by keeping a scarcer, more capable one in reserve for the moment it actually needs it. The exact number of operational HAWK missile launchers and radars currently in Ukrainian service hasn't been published, but we do know the US had a lot of HAWKs sitting in storage, and I mean a lot. Once you start adding in US allies, that HAWK number goes way up. Way back in 2024, I made the case that every ally should send their HAWK missiles to Ukraine. In theory, Ukraine could blanket every major city in multiple HAWK batteries. That still might happen. This is what we have to do as OSINT journalists using open source information to try to peer into what would normally be classified information. We're out here making our best educated, informed guesses until we see evidence in video footage or photos. Also, what's uncertain is exactly how much of the gap this particular missile can close. If paired with another Ukrainian radar or a donated radar from, say, Hensoldt from Germany, HAWK could, in theory, hit some of the ballistic missiles Russia's firing at Kyiv. I promise you, we're not the only ones thinking about the solution to this problem. The Ukrainians are absolutely thinking about what they can put together with the resources they have to better intercept some of these ballistic missiles. So the United States pulled HAWK out of its own inventory 30 years ago, filed it away as a solved problem from a different century, and moved on entirely. Well, Ukraine doesn't have the luxury of moving on from anything that still fires. Not this winter, not at 1% of the interceptor stock it actually needs, with Russia launching Russian junk twice last year's rate, and Allied resupply running at a third of it. The missile system that once existed to stop Soviet bombers now spends its nights over Ukrainian cities, not because anyone believes it's the best tool available, but because every threat it kills is one less demand on a Patriot stockpile that can't currently absorb the ones only Patriot can stop. Whether it's enough is the question nobody can answer from outside Kyiv's own command bunker. What's not in question is which system Ukraine is counting on to buy the one thing every layer of this war eventually runs short of: time. That is it for today, my friends. If this was useful, hit that like button and subscribe. I cover Ukraine's air defense shortages and the systems filling the gaps 4 times a week, and the algorithm loves that signal. For deeper written analysis, I do write on Medium I'll keep my agents on the Hawk situation. I'll get flagged if anything shows up in any kind of open source footage, and I'll update you as soon as that happens. And as always, glory to Ukraine. Glory to the heroes. Crimea is Ukraine.